March 15, 1945. The Rhine Valley, somewhere between Mainz and Mannheim. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the muddy fields where the 7th Army Medical Battalion has established its field hospital. Canvas tents stretch in neat rows, their red cross markings stark against the brown earth scorched by months of artillery bombardment. The air carries the mingled scents of antiseptic, wet canvas, and the lingering smoke from distant fires still burning in the ruins of German towns. Inside one particular tent, the soft whir of a centrifuge mingles with the steady breathing of wounded men lying on canvas cots arranged in precise military formation. Nurse Greta Müller adjusts the plasma drip flowing into the arm of an unconscious American sergeant, her hand steady, despite the tremor in her heart that has not ceased since her capture 48 hours ago. The sergeant's face is pale, almost translucent in the dim light filtering through the canvas walls. A bandage covers the right side of his head where shrapnel from a German 80mm shell had torn through his helmet. His breathing is shallow but regular, and the plasma drips steadily into his bloodstream with mechanical precision. Just 2 days earlier, Greta had worn the gray uniform of the German Red Cross, complete with the distinctive armband that should have protected her under international law, but had become increasingly meaningless as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. Now she wears a borrowed American medical smock, its sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that bear the small scars and chemical stains that mark a career spent in service to the wounded. The man whose life she now tends fought to destroy everything she had been taught to believe in, everything she had sworn to defend with her own life if necessary. The scent of carbolic acid and fresh bandages fills the tent, a familiar aroma that speaks of healing and hope in a world that has known too much of death and despair. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery reminds everyone that the war still rages along the shrinking perimeter of the Third Reich. But inside this tent, something extraordinary is unfolding. Something that will challenge everything Greta thought she knew about her enemies, about her country, about the very nature of humanity itself, and about the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest hours of human conflict. To understand the magnitude of what transpired in that field hospital, we must first comprehend the world from which Greta Müller came, and the ideological poison that had shaped every aspect of her existence for more than a decade. For 12 long years, from the moment Hitler seized power in 1933 until this gray morning in March 1945, the German people had been systematically conditioned through a propaganda machine of unprecedented sophistication and cruelty to view Americans not as fellow human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect, but as subhuman threats to German civilization itself. Nazi propaganda had painted a portrait of Americans as savage, materialistic barbarians driven by Jewish influence and Negro blood contamination, creatures who would show no mercy to captured Germans because they lacked the racial purity and cultural sophistication necessary for true civilization. In medical schools across the Reich, German nursing students were taught that American doctors were incompetent butchers who cared nothing for the sanctity of human life, practitioners of a crude and primitive medicine that reflected the mongrel nature of American society itself. The propaganda films shown in German cinemas depicted American soldiers as gangsters in uniform, men who would torture prisoners for sport and desecrate the bodies of the dead. German radio broadcasts spoke of American plans to sterilize all German women and turn the survivors into slaves for Jewish masters. Even German medical journals published articles claiming that American medical practice was contaminated by Jewish theories that placed no value on Aryan life and sought only to weaken the German people through deliberate malpractice. Greta herself had graduated from the German Red Cross nursing program in 1940, at the height of Nazi power when victory seemed inevitable, and the 1,000-year Reich appeared to be unfolding according to the Führer's grand design. During her induction ceremony in Nuremberg, held in the same massive stadium where Hitler addressed his adoring masses, she had sworn an oath not just to heal the wounded and comfort the dying, but to serve the fatherland and preserve the purity of German blood against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The photographs from that ceremony, preserved in the archives of the Nazi Party, show hundreds of young nurses dressed in spotless white uniforms, their right arms raised in the Roman salute, their faces bright with the certainty that they were embarking on a noble crusade to save European civilization from the mongrel American hordes and their Bolshevik allies. They had been told that their medical skills would be weapons in the racial struggle, tools for ensuring that German blood would flow pure and strong through the veins of future generations while their enemies fell victim to their own genetic inferiority and moral corruption. The Nazi medical establishment had corrupted even the most basic principles of healing, transforming the Hippocratic Oath into a racial manifesto that placed the preservation of German genetic purity above all other considerations. German medical students learned to classify patients according to racial hierarchies that determined not just the quality of care they would receive, but whether they deserved to live at all. Slavic patients were given minimal treatment. Jewish patients were often used for medical experiments, and even German patients deemed genetically inferior were quietly eliminated through programs that served as rehearsals for the mass murder that would follow. By 1945, however, the reality of war had begun to crack the foundations of Nazi ideology like frost-splitting stone. Greta had served on the Eastern Front during the brutal campaigns of 1943 and 1944, where she witnessed horrors that no amount of propaganda could justify or explain away. She had seen German soldiers execute wounded Soviet medics wearing the Red Cross, violations of international law that were not only tolerated but encouraged by SS officers who claimed that Slavic subhumans deserved no mercy. She had watched SS medical officers order the abandonment of critically wounded German soldiers who could not be evacuated quickly enough, leaving them to die in agony rather than risk delaying the retreat. She had seen German doctors conduct medical experiments on Russian prisoners of war, using them as test subjects for new surgical techniques, or simply to satisfy their curiosity about Slavic anatomy. The Noble Crusade had revealed itself to be something far darker and more corrupted than anything she had imagined possible, though she dared not voice such treasonous thoughts even to herself. The retreat from the east had been a nightmare of collapsing supply lines, overwhelmed field hospitals, and increasingly desperate measures to keep German forces fighting against impossible odds. Greta had seen morphine rationed based on racial classifications, with German soldiers receiving priority over foreign volunteers from Croatia or Hungary, who had fought just as bravely for the Reich. She had watched German doctors refuse to treat wounded Russian civilians, leaving women and children to die of infections that could have been easily cured with basic medical care. When American forces finally overran her field hospital near the Rhine, advancing through the morning mist with their weapons at the ready, Greta expected the worst. Nazi indoctrination had prepared her for torture, rape, or summary execution. The propaganda films had shown American soldiers bayoneting German prisoners and burning down hospitals with patients still inside. She had been told that American doctors would use captured German medical personnel for medical experiments, just as German doctors had used captured Russians and Jews. Instead, she found herself face to face with Captain James Morrison, a soft-spoken physician from Toledo, Ohio, who had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School in 1938 and spent the first years of his career treating industrial workers in the steel mills of the Midwest. Captain Morrison was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a college professor rather than a military officer. His uniform was rumpled and stained with blood from hours of surgery, and he moved with the careful economy of motion that marked an experienced surgeon. What happened next would fundamentally alter Greta's understanding of everything she had been taught to believe about her enemies, and about the nature of the conflict that had consumed her world. Captain Morrison did not interrogate her about German troop movements or demand information about secret weapons. He did not strip her of her medical insignia or throw her into a prisoner stockade with the other captured Germans. He did not even raise his voice or display the brutal arrogance that Nazi propaganda had taught her to expect from American officers. Instead, he looked at her hands that bore the telltale stains of iodine and the small scars that came from years of handling surgical instruments and medical equipment, and asked a simple question that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. "How many years of nursing experience do you have?" When she answered in careful English that she had been a qualified nurse for 5 years, Captain Morrison nodded thoughtfully and said words that seemed to come from another universe entirely. Words that challenged every assumption she had ever held about American character and intentions. "We have wounded men who need care. German, American, British, it doesn't matter. If you're willing to take the Hippocratic Oath seriously, we could use your help." Greta's first instinct was to refuse, to declare her loyalty to the Reich, and demand to be treated as a prisoner of war according to the Geneva Convention. Everything in her training screamed that this was a trap, a cruel psychological game designed to break her spirit before the real torture began. She had been prepared for American brutality, but this apparent kindness was more disturbing than any physical abuse could have been. Surely this was a deception, a way of lulling her into compliance before the Americans revealed their true intentions. But as she looked around the American field hospital, taking in details that would remain burned into her memory for decades to come, she saw something that shattered her preconceptions like glass struck by a hammer. German wounded lay on cots next to American soldiers, receiving identical care from medical personnel who moved between patients without regard for nationality or uniform. A black American medic was changing the bandages on a young Wehrmacht private, working with the same gentle attention and professional skill that he showed to his own comrades, speaking softly in broken German to reassure the frightened boy. An American surgeon was operating on a German officer who had been brought in with a shattered femur, working with the same intensity and concentration he would have devoted to saving an American general. The surgical team moved with practiced efficiency, handing instruments back and forth, monitoring vital signs, adjusting anesthesia levels, all the familiar rhythms of emergency medicine that transcended nationality and ideology. This was not the savage barbarism that Nazi propaganda had promised. This was not the racial hatred and medical incompetence that German medical schools had taught her to expect from American doctors. This was medicine as she had learned it in her earliest training, before the racial laws and ideological contamination had poisoned every aspect of German medical practice. This was the pure Hippocratic tradition that transcended nationality, politics, and the artificial hatreds that war had created. The symbolic object that would come to represent this transformation was a simple stethoscope, not German, not American, but universal in its purpose and meaning. Captain Morrison handed Greta his own stethoscope, its metal chest piece worn smooth by years of use, its rubber tubing softened by countless hours of patient care. The instrument was heavier than she expected, solid and reassuring in her hands, a tangible link to the fundamental purpose of medicine that existed beyond the reach of politics and propaganda. "The heart sounds the same in every language," Captain Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of years spent listening to the intimate rhythms of human life. "Listen." As Greta placed the familiar weight of the earpieces in her ears and positioned the chest piece over the heart of a wounded German soldier, she heard not the heartbeat of a member of the master race, but simply the rhythmic proof of a human life struggling to continue. The sound was achingly familiar, the same lub-dub that she had monitored in countless patients over the years. There was nothing Aryan or superior about it, nothing that distinguished it from any other human heart she had ever examined. When she moved to check an American patient at Captain Morrison's suggestion, the sound was identical, the same vulnerable, precious rhythm that marked the boundary between life and death. The American sergeant's heart beat with the same urgent persistence as the German private's, the same desperate determination to keep blood flowing and life continuing, despite the trauma that had brought both men to this place of healing. In the days that followed, as Greta worked alongside American medical personnel in a collaboration that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, she witnessed a revelation that struck at the very core of Nazi ideology and everything she had been taught about American society. The American medical system operated on a principle of abundance that seemed almost miraculous. To someone who had spent years working with increasingly scarce supplies and resources allocated according to racial hierarchies, there was no rationing of morphine based on the nationality or racial classification of the patient. Pain was treated as pain, regardless of whether it was experienced by a German or an American, a Christian or a Jew. Penicillin, that wonder drug that German forces could barely obtain for their own wounded, was administered freely to German prisoners suffering from infections that would have meant certain death in a German field hospital. Blood plasma flowed as readily into German veins as American ones, donated by civilians back home who had lined up at blood banks to help save lives without asking whose lives they might be saving. Dr. Morrison explained the American system to her with quiet pride that was entirely free of boastfulness or arrogance. "We prepared for this invasion by stockpiling 800,000 pints of blood plasma," he said as they walked between the rows of patients. 600,000 doses of penicillin, We have 15 hospital ships dedicated solely to medical evacuation, and 50 aircraft specially equipped for transporting the wounded. Not for Americans alone, but for anyone who needs healing. This abundance was not merely material. It was philosophical and moral. It represented a worldview that saw medical care not as a privilege to be rationed, based on racial or national hierarchies, but as a fundamental human right that belonged to all people, regardless of their politics or the uniform they wore. The contrast with her own experience was stark and deeply troubling. She remembered German field hospitals where wounded foreign workers were left to die in agony so that German soldiers could receive priority treatment. She remembered being ordered to conserve morphine for racially valuable patients, while others suffered through procedures without anesthesia. But perhaps the most profound moment in Greta's transformation came when she was asked to assist in the treatment of a wounded British paratrooper who had been brought in during the night. The young man, barely 20 years old, had been shot through the chest during a reconnaissance mission behind German lines. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, clear signs of a punctured lung that would prove fatal without immediate surgical intervention. As she prepared the surgical instruments with the same meticulous care she had learned during her training in Germany, Greta found herself thinking about her brother Hans, who had been killed in the bombing of Dresden just a month earlier. This British soldier might have been one of the airmen who dropped those bombs, one of the men responsible for the firestorm that had consumed her childhood home and taken the life of the only family she had left in the world. By the logic she had been taught, by the racial ideology that had shaped her thinking for more than a decade, she should feel nothing but hatred for this enemy who had contributed to German suffering. She should see him not as a patient deserving of care, but as a representative of the forces that were destroying her homeland and her people. The Nazi medical establishment would have classified him as an enemy to be eliminated, not a life to be saved. Instead, as she watched Dr. Morrison work to save the young man's life, inserting a chest tube to drain the blood from his lungs and carefully suturing the damaged tissue, she felt only the familiar professional satisfaction that came from participating in the ancient art of healing. When the surgery was successful and the British soldier opened his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," in accented German that he had learned from captured German soldiers, Greta experienced an epiphany that would reshape her understanding of humanity itself. The stethoscope became her constant companion during those weeks in the American field hospital, a bridge between worlds that had been taught to see each other as mortal enemies. She used it to monitor German patients recovering from surgery, American soldiers suffering from infections, British paratroopers healing from wounds, even liberated Russian prisoners of war who had been worked nearly to death in German labor camps and were now receiving the same quality medical care as everyone else. The heartbeat was always the same, not Aryan or Slavic or Anglo-Saxon, but simply human. The rhythm of life that connected all people regardless of the artificial divisions that politics and ideology sought to impose. In that steady lub-dub, she heard a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure, that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the competing ideologies lay a common humanity that transcended all the reasons men found to hate and kill each other. As the weeks passed and spring began to soften the harsh landscape of war-torn Germany, Greta began to understand that what she was experiencing was not merely medical cooperation, but a demonstration of democratic values in action. The American medical system reflected a society that, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated on the principle that all human lives possessed inherent dignity and worth. This was not the racial hierarchy that Nazi ideology demanded, but something far more revolutionary. The radical proposition that a black medic and a white surgeon could work as equals, that a German nurse could be trusted to care for enemy soldiers, that healing transcended the artificial boundaries that politics sought to impose. She witnessed American doctors training German medical personnel in new surgical techniques, sharing knowledge that could save lives without regard for national security or competitive advantage. She saw American medical supplies being used to treat German civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease, resources that could have been reserved for American use but were instead distributed based solely on medical need. The documentation of these experiences exists not just in official military records, but in the personal accounts of those who lived through them and were transformed by what they witnessed. The U.S. Army Medical Department's own reports from the European theater note that captured German medical personnel were routinely employed in American field hospitals, and that this policy proved both practically successful and psychologically transformative for all involved. As one American surgeon wrote in his personal diary, preserved now in the National Archives, "These German nurses and doctors arrived at our hospital expecting brutality and found brotherhood. They came prepared for vengeance and discovered mercy. The change in their faces over the course of a few weeks was remarkable to witness. They began to see us not as enemies, but as fellow human beings committed to the same fundamental purpose, preserving life and alleviating suffering." For Greta, the transformation was indeed remarkable and complete. She began to question not just Nazi racial theory, but the entire worldview that had shaped her life since childhood. If Americans could show such compassion to their enemies, what did that say about the German cause she had served so faithfully? If a democratic society could produce doctors willing to expend precious resources on enemy wounded, what did that suggest about the relative moral worth of the competing systems that had driven the world to war? The most powerful and disturbing moment came when she was assigned to help treat a group of liberated concentration camp prisoners who had been brought to the American field hospital suffering from starvation, disease, and the systematic brutalization that had been inflicted upon them in the name of German racial purity. These walking skeletons bore witness to crimes that she had heard whispered about but had never been forced to confront directly, as she helped to feed them carefully measured portions of food. Too much too quickly would overwhelm their damaged digestive systems and kill them. She confronted the ultimate horror of what her nation had become. These were not the subhuman enemies that Nazi propaganda had described, but ordinary people who had been systematically tortured and murdered for no reason other than their ethnic or religious identity. One of the survivors, a Jewish doctor from Vienna named Aaron Goldstein, who had somehow maintained his medical knowledge and humanity through years of hell, worked alongside her with hands that shook from malnutrition but retained their healing skill. Dr. Goldstein spoke to her in careful German, his voice gentle despite everything he had endured, his eyes holding depths of suffering that she could barely comprehend. "You are not responsible for this," he told her, as they tended to his fellow survivors, men and women who had been reduced to living skeletons by the systematic cruelty of the Nazi state. "But now you have a responsibility to remember, and to bear witness and to ensure that such things never happen again." The stethoscope that had become her symbol of transformation took on new meaning as she listened to the labored breathing of men and women who had been marked for extermination simply because of who they were. The sound was the same as every other heartbeat she had monitored, the same precious, vulnerable rhythm of life asserting itself against death and hatred and the forces that sought to destroy human dignity. Working with these survivors forced Greta to confront the full extent of German crimes and her own complicity in the system that had made such horrors possible. She had not personally participated in the mass murders, but she had served a regime that committed them. She had worn the uniform of a state that had made genocide its official policy. She had sworn an oath to preserve German racial purity that had provided the ideological justification for unspeakable atrocities. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, but it was also liberating. For the first time in her adult life, she could see clearly the moral landscape that propaganda had obscured. She could distinguish between the lies she had been told and the truth she was now witnessing. The American medical personnel, who treated both German prisoners and concentration camp survivors with equal compassion, were demonstrating values that her own nation had abandoned in its pursuit of racial supremacy and territorial conquest. As the war in Europe drew to its inevitable close, with German resistance collapsing on all fronts and the Third Reich crumbling into ruins, Greta faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could return to Germany and attempt to rebuild her existence within the shattered remains of the society that had shaped her, pretending that her experience with the Americans had been merely an aberration in the natural order of things, or she could embrace the new understanding that her time with the American Medical Corps had given her, accepting the responsibility that came with knowledge and dedicating herself to healing the wounds that ideology had inflicted upon the world. Captain Morrison, who had become not just a professional colleague but something approaching a friend, offered her a different path entirely. "We're going to need people to help rebuild," he said during one of their conversations as they walked between the hospital tents in the fading light of evening. "People who understand both worlds, who can serve as bridges between former enemies. You've proven that healing transcends hatred. That's going to be essential in the years ahead." The stethoscope he had first handed her remained in her possession, a tangible reminder of the moment when her world had changed forever. Years later, when she worked as a nurse in displaced persons camps, helping to care for refugees from across Europe who had been uprooted by war and persecution, she would remember that first shocking encounter with American medical practice. The abundance of supplies that seemed almost wasteful to German eyes, the equality of treatment that ignored racial hierarchies, the radical notion that human dignity knew no national boundaries. These lessons became the foundation of her new life and her new understanding of what medicine could be when freed from the corruptions of ideology and nationalism. But the impact of her experience extended far beyond one woman's personal transformation. Greta was one of thousands of German medical personnel who encountered American medical practice during the final stages of the war, and their collective testimony helped to reshape German understanding of American society and democratic values in the years that followed. Many of these former enemies became advocates for democracy and human rights in the new German Republic, carrying with them the memory of American compassion shown to German prisoners at the moment of Germany's greatest defeat. They had expected vengeance and found mercy. They had prepared for brutality and discovered brotherhood. These experiences became part of the foundation upon which German-American friendship was rebuilt in the decades following the war. The stethoscope that symbolized Greta's transformation represents something larger and more enduring than individual conversion or personal redemption. It embodies the power of democratic values to transform even the most bitter conflicts into opportunities for healing and reconciliation. The American medical system's treatment of enemy wounded was not merely a matter of following the Geneva Convention or adhering to international law. It was a demonstration of the practical application of the democratic principle that all human beings possess inherent dignity and worth. This principle extended beyond the medical corps to American policy toward prisoners of war in general. While other nations often treated captured enemies as subhuman creatures deserving of abuse and exploitation, American forces generally followed policies that recognized the basic humanity of their prisoners. German POWs held in American camps received medical care that was often superior to what German civilians were receiving in their bombed cities. They were fed adequately, housed in reasonable conditions, and treated with a respect that many had never experienced even in their own military. These policies were not perfect, and there were certainly instances of abuse and mistreatment that violated American ideals. But the general pattern was one of attempting to maintain human dignity even in the midst of total war. This approach reflected deeply held American beliefs about the nature of democracy and human rights that went far beyond mere military strategy or diplomatic calculation. In our modern world, where political divisions seem to grow deeper each day, and ideological conflicts threaten to tear apart the fabric of civil society, the story of Greta Müller in the American Field Hospital offers a profound lesson about the possibility of redemption and reconciliation even in the darkest circumstances. It reminds us that beneath the surface of ideological conflict lies a common humanity that no amount of propaganda can fully obscure. It suggests that abundance, not just material abundance, but abundance of compassion, of dignity, of respect for human life, can be more powerful than any weapon in transforming hearts and minds and building bridges between former enemies. The American abundance that so impressed Greta Müller and countless other German prisoners was not merely a matter of superior industrial capacity or better logistics, though these things certainly mattered. It was abundance of spirit, the generous belief that all human life possesses value and dignity, regardless of the circumstances of birth or the accidents of history that determine nationality and allegiance. This abundance stood in stark contrast to the scarcity mentality that had driven Nazi ideology, the belief that resources were limited and that one group could prosper only at the expense of others. The Nazi worldview was fundamentally based on competition and conflict, on the notion that life was a zero-sum game in which the strong survived by destroying the weak. The American approach demonstrated a different possibility, that prosperity and human dignity could be expanded rather than hoarded, that healing and compassion could be offered without diminishing one's own security or well-being. This was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of what Greta witnessed in that field hospital. The practical demonstration that generosity and compassion were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength. The stethoscope still exists today, preserved in a small medical museum in Toledo, Ohio, where Captain Morrison's family donated his medical instruments after his death in 1987. Visitors often ask about its significance, and the museum guide tells them about a German nurse who discovered that the heart sounds the same in every language, and about American doctors who proved that healing can transcend even the most bitter hatred. The story has become part of the museum's permanent exhibition on medical ethics and human rights, a reminder that the principles of medical care transcend national boundaries and political ideologies. Medical students who visit the museum often spend long minutes examining the simple instrument, trying to imagine the moral courage it must have taken for both German and American medical personnel to work together in the midst of total war. Today, as we face new challenges and new divisions that threaten to undermine the foundations of democratic society, we might do well to remember the lesson of that field hospital in the Rhine Valley. In a world that often seems determined to emphasize differences and divisions, the simple act of listening to a heartbeat reminds us of our common humanity and our shared vulnerability. The American abundance that transformed Greta Muller's understanding was not just abundance of material resources, though that certainly played a role. It was abundance of spirit, the generous belief that human dignity is not a finite resource to be hoarded and protected, but an infinite quality that grows stronger when it is shared and extended, even to those who have been taught to see themselves as enemies. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to this story comes from Greta's own words, recorded in an interview she gave to a local television station 50 years after the war's end. By then an elderly woman living in Philadelphia, where she had immigrated in 1947 and worked as a nurse until her retirement, she still kept Captain Morrison's stethoscope in a place of honor in her home, displayed in a small frame alongside photographs from her years of service in American hospitals. "I went to that American field hospital expecting to encounter monsters," she said, her voice still carrying traces of her German accent, but speaking with the confidence of someone who had found her true home. "Instead, I found human beings who showed me what my country could have become if we had chosen the path of healing rather than destruction. That stethoscope taught me the most important lesson of my life, that the heart sounds the same in every language, and that the capacity for good exists in every human soul, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge." She paused in the interview, her aged hands trembling slightly as she held the instrument that had changed her life. "Captain Morrison could have treated me as an enemy. He could have used me for information or propaganda or simply ignored me as another German prisoner. Instead, he handed me that stethoscope and invited me to join him in the work of healing. He showed me that democracy is not just a political system, but a way of seeing other people, even your enemies, as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect." The war ended more than 3/4 of a century ago, but the lesson remains as relevant today as it was in that field hospital in 1945. In a world still torn by conflict and division, still struggling with the legacy of hatred and prejudice, the simple act of healing, of seeing past ideology and nationalism to the common humanity that unites us all, offers hope that even the deepest wounds can be healed, and that former enemies can become partners in building a better world. The stethoscope remembers what we sometimes forget in our modern rush toward polarization and conflict, that beneath the surface of political disagreement, ideological division, and national enmity lies the steady, universal rhythm of the human heart, fragile, precious, and ultimately the same in every chest where it beats. In that rhythm lies both our vulnerability and our hope, our common mortality and our shared capacity for redemption. It reminds us that we are all patients in the great hospital of human existence, all dependent on the care and compassion of others for our survival and flourishing. This is the true victory that emerged from that field hospital in the Rhine Valley. Not the triumph of one army over another, but the triumph of healing over hatred, of compassion over cruelty, of the democratic ideal that all human beings, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the flags they serve, possess an inherent dignity that no ideology can diminish and no conflict can destroy. The lesson echoes still in the quiet spaces where healing takes place, in hospitals and clinics around the world where medical personnel continue the work that Captain Morrison and Greta Miller began in that tent beside the Rhine. Every time a doctor or nurse treats a patient without regard for their politics or nationality or social status, they honor the memory of that moment when enemies became healers and hatred gave way to hope. The heart sounds the same in every language. The stethoscope remembers, and in its memory lies a truth that transcends all the artificial divisions that separate us. That we are all, ultimately, members of the same human family, united by our common need for healing and our shared capacity to provide it.